And that brings us to the question of power dynamics. They always exist in any reporting situation, but maybe they are more acute in a situation where these migrants are in such an incredibly vulnerable position. How did you address those power dynamics to fully get their trust?
So I think that, one thing was on the trail when we met migrants, of course, they were very surprised to see us, and we immediately explained our role as journalists. And I often, waited quite a long time. It could have been hours or, days before kind of expressing any type of interest in interviewing somebody necessarily. And I focused a lot in just building up rapport with the people who I was walking with. There were a lot of times where I actually, there wasn't even really much prompting necessary. And sometimes stories, information would just kind of overflow. I think the big kind of power difference was in that most migrants start out on this trail with smugglers who, after the first day or two, abandon them. And in our case, we had hired smuggler guides for the entire trip. They abandoned us, probably 8 hours before, and it was a planned abandonment.
Okay.
Before we reached the trail's end. And so obviously by us having these guides with us, this provided us with a really huge safety net. That was the whole point. And so to migrants, I think we really represented that safety net. And so we never pressured migrants to walk together. It was kind of naturally advantageous to them. I think they immediately saw that. A lot of people who we came across had already been robbed of all of their possessions. A lot of them had either, very little food left or hadn't eaten in days and days. And so just seeing anybody in the jungle who wasn't going to rob them, they automatically kind of start moving together, safety in numbers, right? In our case, we had guides who were able to advise on, don't cross the river here. It's too deep. It's too dangerous. They knew the Darien like the back of their hand. We weren't getting lost with them. So migrants kind of naturally wanted to walk with us. But I think the key was never telling them, never giving instructions on what to do or not. The choice was always theirs. And I think some of the more difficult decisions revolved around, the different resources. So as I mentioned, most of them hadn't eaten in days by some point on the trail. And so we had to decide whether or not we were going to share our food. And these were people who, we were walking with, sleeping with, camping with. And so we did decide to share our food. I think it would have been quite an untenable reporting situation when you're embedded with a group like that, for us to have been eating and them to not be eating. And I also feel like it was the right thing. It was the right thing to do.
Were there any situations that you totally had not anticipated and where you had to make a judgment call on the spot?
I think one of the, there were a lot of unexpected kind of challenges just getting onto the migrant trail. So there were kind of a chain of mini disasters. We weren't expecting that it would be so difficult to get on the migrant trail and to join up with it. And so we had to sometimes make some pretty split decisions in front of Panamanian military officials who had basically surrounded this hamlet that we were in and were not letting us leave the town. So those were unexpected logistical challenges. I think that the most kind of the toughest moment in terms of making an ethical decision was when we came across a Cameroonian who is in the piece. His name is George, and he had been left behind by his group. He was very injured. He was basically either hobbling or crawling. And he really begged us to take him with us and to carry him. And it was one of these moments where I felt like either the only way to transport him out would be to basically abandon our entire reporting trip and try to construct something, a stretcher, and get our guides to try to carry him. The guides, decided this was impossible. He's a large man, but that was a very difficult moment where I felt like I was choosing between a reporting trip and helping someone who was in dire need, but also knowing that he was definitely not going to be the only one we were going to come across in that situation.
I want to add something, which is that scene is in the piece.
Yeah.
And it should also be added, and it's also reported in the piece, which is the Cameroonians felt enormously guilty about leaving him behind. And when they got to the migrant camp in Panama, pooled their money to hire someone to find him. He did emerge from the Darien Gap, and this is not in the story, but he was the first person to cross the U.S. border before the other Cameroonians to seek asylum.
That is incredible.
But I think one of the most powerful scenes in the piece is exactly this moment when you see his panic and he's wondering, what he's going to do and whether he's going to die. And the guides, his shoulder is seriously hurt, and they try to repair it a little bit. And it's, and it's a kind of naked moment in the story.